Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of some translated fantasy books that I'm hoping to get around to in 2021. I want to read more translated works for a few different reasons, one of which has to do with the fact that most of publishing is very centered around American publishing industries and UK as well, and then so we find that even when we want diversity in our reading and we want our reading to be more varied, it's still through the lens of UK and American publishing houses and authors and so on and so forth. And I think if there's more of a demand for the stories that are around the world, then we have a better chance of those stories being heard. And that starts by creating the demand by wanting to read it. Also, I've just always found it's a really interesting conversation, the objective versus subjective when it comes to a book's quality. I'm of the mindset that it's completely subjective, and part of what proves that is a lot of times what is valued in writing in a different country is very different from another country. And I think it's just really cool to see how there's different writing techniques and the utilization of structure of sentences, of different metaphors and things like that. There's just different things that are represented in translated works. And also, I am quite the fan of Witcher, and I would really like to see some other books that maybe don't get the attention that they deserve, and be kind of cool if it didn't take a really awesome video game to clue us in on some stories. So I have 5 books on this list. We have one that is translated from French, one that is Indian, one that is Chinese. I lied a second ago, we actually have a second one that is French, and then we have a Russian one. And I know that doesn't showcase everywhere around the world. I'm obviously lacking some South American authors here and some African authors here. So if you guys have any of your own recommendations for either of those 2 places or for anywhere else in the world for some translated works, this will be where I come back to check for your recommendations. Jumping into the list, the first one would be A Hero Born. This is the one that is translated from Chinese. This one is historical fantasy. It's heavily inspired by Chinese history. It says it's more the setting of 1200 AD. And the description for this one says that our main hero, Jing, is the son of a murdered Song patriot. He is humble, loyal, perhaps not altogether wise, and is fated from birth to one day confront an opponent who is the opposite of him in every way, privileged, cunning, and flawlessly trained in the martial arts. Jing must return to China, to the Garden of the Drunken Immortals in Shaijing, to fulfill his destiny, but in a divided land, his courage and his loyalties will be tested at every turn. When looking up all of these, the most common criticism I have found is that there seems to be some things lost in translation, and perhaps some word choices are not the easiest to follow or don't always seem to make perfect sense. So I think I'm going to have to keep that in mind with all of these. But regardless, I still think that this sounds really good. I know that Genghis Khan plays a role in this story, so I'm really excited to see this one. The next one on the list is not quite fantasy. It's more historical fiction, but with some interesting things mixed in. I think it's meant to shed light on a very horrifying time in history by sort of having an absurdist, abstract sort of representation of this terrible thing. So the description for this book, Max, which is translated from French, says that carefully selected German women are recruited by the Nazis to give birth to new members of the Aryan race. Inside one of these women is Max, literally counting the minutes until he is born and can fulfill his destiny as the perfect Aryan specimen. Max is taken away from his birth mother soon after he enters the world. Raised under the ideology and direction of the Nazi Party, he grows up without any family, without affection or tenderness, and quickly becomes the mascot of the program. That is, until he meets Lucas, a young Jewish boy whom he knows he is meant to despise. Instead, the friendship that blossoms changes Max's world forever. That one seems like it's going to be incredibly hard-hitting, but also very strange, as I think that you might even get the perspective when it's in the womb, perhaps. I've heard that there's a lot of language in this book, that the character, despite being a small child, often is cursing and saying terrible things to people, and it sounds kind of bizarre, but I think excited is the wrong way to put it. I'm not excited for this book, but I'm definitely intrigued. The next book on the list is upon a burning throne. If you happen to watch the buddy reads video that I did, this is going to be one of the buddy reads in 2021. So if you'd like to buddy read this alongside myself and Jessie from the channel Jessie May, I'll have information for that link down below. And the description for this one says, in a world where demigods and demons walk among mortals, the emperor of the vast burnt empire has died, leaving a turbulent realm without an emperor. 2 young princes are in line to rule, but birthright does not guarantee inheritance. For any successor must sit upon the legendary burning throne and pass the test of fire. Imbued with dark sorceries, the throne is a crucible, one that incinerates the unworthy. The princes are declared heirs to the empire, but there is another with a claim to power, another who also survives, a girl from an outlying kingdom. This one has not particularly high ratings on Goodreads, and it has very few ratings, but again, I'm wondering if some of that has to do with the translation. I know that this particular author is known for taking some mythology and making it more modern in its presentation, making it more accessible. So I think that sometimes when you take some of these stories that they're very different, a lot of times when you're talking about gods and goddesses and demigods and things like that, it's so far from what we're accustomed to now that it can be a lot to take in. But either way, this one, once again, I feel like excited maybe isn't the right word, but I think all of these sound interesting. I mean, I'm wanting to read them all. Next up is a book that I kept meaning to get to in 2020 and just never got around to it, but want to read it next year, and that would be The Night Watch. This is translated from Russian. This is an urban fantasy, and the description for this one says, Night Watch is a nuanced story of the others, mortals who gain supernatural powers and the struggle between philosophies the others align with, the light or the darkness. It's a conflict of philosophy that's complex, compelling, and fuels the conflicts and plots found within the series. Night Watch is no simple urban fantasy novel about witches and warlocks and good and bad. No, it's the story of the endless struggle between good and evil, and more importantly, the delicate yet infinite space between these dichotomies. It's that tricky space between the good and even, the complex shades of gray. What is good and what is evil when evil is good and good is evil? I don't read a ton of urban fantasy. I actually do tend to like the fantasy that has more to do with kings and queens and knights and swords and all that kind of stuff. Very basic. So I don't pick up urban fantasy all that often, but I'm excited that one of the translated works on this list is urban fantasy because I don't dislike it. I just don't gravitate toward it. So I'm excited that one of these is an urban fantasy. This last one is the one that I think out of all of these sounds like it's going to fit my taste the most. And this is also translated from French, and that would be The Cardinal's Blades. It says that it's based around a time of political upheaval, religious conflict, deadly court intrigue, and brutal war between the great European powers. And you add dragons to the mix, and you get the swashbuckling fantasy, The Cardinal's Blades by Pierre Pavel. It imagines a world where the elite French spies mount magnificent dragons and seek to derail plots by the Spanish and Italians to destabilize France. I think all these sound really fantastic. I tried to find ones that were fairly different from each other, but like I said, if you have your own recommendations, please feel free to leave those in the comments down below, because I would love to get to see more fantasy books from other places around the world. But anyway, let me know your thoughts on these if you have read them. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.